This video is for students from CREN Javier Rojo Gómez Unidad Cancún who are preparing for Cambridge preliminary exam. In particular, we're going to talk about reading part 4. In this part of the exam, you're tested on your ability to understand how a text is structured. You will read a longer text with 5 gaps where whole sentences have been removed. From 8 options, you need to choose which sentences go in the 5 gaps. 3 of the options are not going to be used. So, what are the tips? Begin skimming the text for its overall gist, which means read it really quickly to get an understanding of the text. Then read the 8 sentences, the 8 options, and read them carefully and think about the type of information that is missing from each gap. Consider the context, in other words, what's happening in the text. Ask yourself, what is it about? What is the situation? And then you need to look closely at the language before and after the gap because it may give you clues about the missing sentences. For example, was the writer about to introduce a reason for something or a contrasting idea or list something? So let's give it a go and see how it is done. After a quick reading of the text, I understand that this is a story about a lost dog that was found and how it was returned to the previous owners. So let's look at the first paragraph and the first missing gap. It says it was wearing a blue collar, but there was no sign of an owner anywhere. So I go back to the 8 options and it says I made sure that all of them were pet owners. It makes no sense. I decided to travel to Chicago. It's still not saying anything. It took 20 drivers. I asked the dog if it wanted to come home with me. I hope he won't go wandering around. His owners, it was clearly hungry and needed to rest. This is a plausible option. G, it was clearly hungry and needed to rest. I didn't know who the dog belonged to. This is also a plausible option because of what the text was saying until now. But it doesn't, I have no clue in the before the gap what is the next sentence. So I'm going to move forward to after the gap. I was only joking, but it came running to me. So for me, this part that says I was only joking, it gave me an idea that I have to look for something particular in the options. I made sure, I decided, it took, I asked the dog. So it says I asked the dog, which is something that is not very common, if it wanted to come home with me. So looking at it, it gives me an idea that actually maybe this would be the possible answer for the first gap. That would be D, I asked the dog and I was only joking. It makes sense right here. Okay. So let's continue in the next missing gap. I'm not paying attention to details because I have to concentrate in the gap. And it says he had an owner and a home. The trouble was that his home was in Chicago, over 2,000 miles away. Banjo had been missing for over a year, and this is the gap. So let's see what are some possible answers. Remember that since these are already taken, this is not an option for us. I made sure that all of them were pet owners. It makes no sense to be this one. I decided to travel to Chicago. This is a possibility for us. I hope he won't go wandering again. It doesn't make sense with what he's saying so far. His owner, Tina and Dawn, were amazed. This also makes sense to hear from me. It was clearly hungry and needed to rest. It makes no sense to use these right now. So I also see that there is a missing sentence, and then the next sentence begins with banjo. So option B cannot be the one, specifically because it ends with banjo, and when we are writing something, we don't, it would make more sense that the next sentence will start with it. So this is not a possibility. And then I also see in the next sentence that it says they also had no idea, and this they refers to somebody that I cannot find in the text. So let me see if I have any of the sentences that is giving me an idea who they are. And actually it does. His owners, Tina and Dan, were amazed to hear from me. It makes sense for the answer to be F. So what happens here is that I've already used D, and this gives me an idea that the 17th option, or the number 17, the gap, would be his owners, and we have a sentence that has a pronoun that refers to these people. So far so good. Be very careful, choose wisely, read carefully, because once you use an option, this will affect all your other answers. So let's see. It says, it wasn't long before we had a long list of volunteers who wanted to help Banjo to get home. He says before that I used social media to ask for help. So let's see what would be possible options. I decided to travel to Chicago, can be one. I hope he won't go wandering again. It doesn't make sense with what is said previously. It was clearly hungry and needed to rest. Well, we're finished. This is not a possibility because we're finished talking about the conditions of the dog. I didn't know who the dog belonged to. This is also not a possibility because we already know who the owners are. So these are not possible answers. Let's see what it says after the gap. It was important that they knew how to take care of Banjo. And also, first of all, there is this part that it shows importance. It was important, and it also says they knew. And obviously in the sentence before that sentence, there has to be some information of who they are. Let's see. It says it wasn't long before we had a long list of volunteers. So maybe volunteers is exactly that, who wanted to help Banjo. So we already have a relationship here, they to volunteers. It was important. We have to stick with this one, and let's see what we have. These two are not possible. These two are not possible. I hope you won't go wandering again. It took 20 drivers 4 days to reunite Banjo with his family. It doesn't say right now, but this A says, I made sure that all of them were pet owners. And let's see, it was important that they knew how to take care of Banjo. So if you see this they relates to them. So obviously referring to the volunteers. So we found a missing sentence that would be A for this one. As you can see, I use clues from the sentences before and after to find the best fitting sentence. So far so good. Let's see. We've used sentence A. We've used sentence D. And we've used sentence F. And let's see what's going for number 19 and 20. Remember that you're going to have 3 sentences that will be left out. And it says that Banjo set off on his journey. He traveled through many states before he reached his home state of Illinois. Okay? And then it says Banjo was delighted to meet the new baby. So, and it's never before it's not mentioned immediately before. It was mentioned in the text earlier, but not immediately before. So let's see if we find a sentence that makes a reference to that. And also it says to be back home. So obviously Banjo has already returned. I decided to travel. This is not an option because obviously Banjo was not taken by the person that found him. Then it says it took 20 drivers 4 days to reunite Banjo with his family. And then it says, I hope he won't go wandering again. This one doesn't make sense because you cannot say he before and Banjo, it was clearly hungry. I didn't know who the dog belonged. So obviously here it makes more sense to use C. It took 20 drivers 4 days to reunite Banjo with his family. And in this part, reunite Banjo with his family, it says it makes sense to connect with meet the new baby and with go back home. No? So we found the next answer. That would be C. And we have only one left. Let's see. It says his owners were thrilled to have him back. And then he says Banjo's story just goes to show what people can achieve when they all work together. So let's see the possibilities. I made sure that all of them were pet owners. This is already used. I decided to travel. This is not how the story goes or the situation. This is C is already used. D is already used. I hope he won't go wandering again. Yes, it makes sense. This is one of the things that you have to do, is you have to read it together and see if it makes sense. It was clearly hungry. I didn't know who the dog belonged to. These two options are not plausible for the end of the story. So it leaves us with only one option, and that would be E. And it does make sense. Let's see. His owners were thrilled to have him back. I hope he won't go wandering again. Banjo's story just goes to show what people can achieve when they all work together. It kind of wraps up the whole story of the dog being lost and being taken to the place and being found, and this is kind of the perception or the feeling of the author, and that will be our last answer. As you can see, it's very important that you read the story, get an overall understanding of what it is about, what is the situation, what is happening, because you read all the sentences and all the sentences might be possibilities, but when you look more closely to the structure of the story and to the sequence of the events and also to details in the sentences before and after, you can easily find the right answer. I know this is kind of an easy one, or at least I find it easy, but I hope with me showing you visually what I was doing to make the best choice for each space, I hope you do better in your next mock exam.